Having talked about polarity, it makes sense to talk about solubility. Solubility, if you remember, is the ability of two substances to be able to mix and form a solution. Polarity has to do with an asymmetrical distribution of charge. The reason why we study polarity is because two liquids will mix if they are both chemically alike. So two solutions have to be both polar in order for them to mix properly, or both nonpolar in order for them to mix properly. If you try mixing a polar and nonpolar substance, they're going to separate into what's called a suspension. Now you remember that water is a polar molecule because it consists of two nonmetals where oxygen has a partial negative charge and hydrogen has a partial positive charge. This asymmetrical distribution of charge causes the water molecule to be polar. Now, if you try adding a polar substance to water, notice that because the negative side of that polar substance, indicated by this yellow ellipse, is going to be attracted to the positive side of water, whereas the positive side of the polar substance is going to be attracted to the negative side of water. This is what allows a polar substance to dissolve within water. There's a saying regarding polarity that like dissolves like. Two like substances are going to dissolve if they're both polar or if they're both nonpolar. So for example, sugar is a polar substance. You add that to water, the negative side will be attracted to the positive hydrogens, and the positive side of that polar molecule will be attracted to the negative oxygens. If you try adding two polar substances next to water, notice that they're going to stick to each other. And the reason why that is because what's happening is the positive side of that polar molecule is going to be attracted to the negative oxygen, and likewise, the negative side of that polar substance is going to be attracted to the positive hydrogens. So this is what causes water to be sticky or adhere to itself. And water is a polar molecule, and it will happily mix with other polar substances. So what happens if you add a nonpolar substance to water? Well, you probably noticed what happens. Nonpolar substances are things like oil. They have a symmetrical distribution of charge. So there's no net positive side or net negative side existing within the oil molecule. And because of that, oil will want to separate from the water and form its own layer. Notice that the nonpolar molecules are forming a layer because they're attracted to other nonpolar substances, whereas the water, which is polar, is forming its own layer. So let's try some questions that deal with this idea. State, in terms of molecular polarity, why ethanol is soluble in water. Remember, the word soluble just means able to dissolve in water. What gives ethanol its ability to dissolve in water is the fact that it's also polar, like water. So acceptable responses include both ethanol molecules and water molecules are both polar, or you could simply state that water molecules and ethanol molecules have similar polarity. So if a substance is able to dissolve in water, it must be polar. If it's not able to dissolve in water, it must be nonpolar. So if you remember that like dissolves like, or like will dissolve in other similar chemical substances, then you'll be fine when it comes to these regions problems. Thank you for watching.